Right, so I can see we are hitting on 12:30 now. So I'm going to kick us off because we just have the hour here today for this lunchtime session. First of all, a huge welcome and thank you ever so much for joining us. This session forms part of the MPMS training program this year. So it's a series of training webinars and events and opportunities for MPMS volunteers. And also anybody interested in becoming an MPMS volunteer. Perhaps we can inspire you today. I'm Rachel Murphy, which I realise I should have said earlier on. I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, and I am super duper happy to hand over now to Neill Talbot of Avellana Ecology, who, as well as being a super experienced ecologist, Neill's actually been volunteering for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme since before I believe it even was the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, as it is today. So not only does Neill bring a wealth of experience, he also brings with him his sort of MPMS hat from a volunteer perspective. So thank you ever so much, Neill. Really looking forward to today's session. Thank you, everyone.
Right, thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. So the talk, the webinar is called How to Identify Native Aquatic Plants. It will be predominantly native plants, but there's a few introduced or non-native species as well, and I will highlight those as I go through. So I can talk about this at the end a bit more when I have questions, but I've used various sources for identification. These include the Wildflower Key by Francis Rose and the freshwater plant, British water plants, Haslam, Sinker and Wolsey, which is the Field Studies Council publication. Also the Field Studies Council Commoner Water Plants handout is fold out chart is really useful, but I'll mention a few other things as we go along. So first of all, just going to do a quick introduction on why wetlands are so important. So wetlands do support a huge range of plant and animal species in comparison to areas that are drier. So you'll get, a lot of things like the frogs that are shown on there, dragonflies, damselflies, and so on, fish, aquatic, invertebrates. I won't run through all of them because there's a huge amount, but obviously it will, and also a lot as we're more interested in for this talk, the huge variety of plants that you won't find, say, in a meadow or a dry area of woodland. And it's important to remember that small ponds will even contain a huge and disproportionately large abundance and diversity of species. So they are particularly important in a sort of biodiversity context, and as is happening with biodiversity in this country and worldwide, it's under threat from climate change and loss of habitat and various other threats, which I'll talk about a bit later. But I'll just move on now to what the different habitats are. That this isn't totally comprehensive, but it's more of a summary of the sort of habitats that you will find wetland plants in. So lakes and ponds, there's some debate about what the definition of a difference between a lake and a pond is. I won't get into that now, but lakes are generally larger, but there are other qualifications. So ponds, most ponds are man-made, but you do get some natural ponds, and also got things like ditches and reams, canals, reed beds, blanket bog, raised bog, lowland fen, and valley mire. So the species we're going to look at, we're not going to be looking at the species of bog and fen and mire today, really. We're prioritize because we've only got a short amount of time looking at more the first few habitats, and I'm not going to be covering on the whole. I might mention occasionally, but not going to be covering running water. So just as an example, there's a picture on the top left of an oblong-leaved sundew, and that's sort of species you will find in bog habitats. It's also, you'll get things like sphagnum moss and so on in those. And the bottom picture, that's sort of like more of a lake with a reed bed sort of habitat there as well. So as far as the NPMS goes, this talk is sort of focusing more on the broad habitat, freshwater, and then two specific habitats, nutrient poor lakes and ponds, and nutrient rich lakes and ponds. There are a lot of overlaps in the species that will be recorded in those, but I've put a photo at the top of a typical indicator species is ivy-leaved duckweed. So this is one of the many duckweeds or lemna species that you'll find. It's quite different in appearance to some of the other duckweeds, but I'd highly recommend. There's a very good guide that you can use to help you identify duckweeds, and that's the Opal Guide, and it's something the Natural History Museum actually instigated. It used to be a sort of survey that you could complete and send data through, but that's no longer happening. But you can still get the information from. You can download a PDF with the Duckweeds Guide, and it's very helpful to identify those species. So I've also mentioned another species that's a typical indicator species on the NPMS habitats list is bogbean, and we'll talk about bogbean as one of the native species later. So nutrient poor ones are those are ones that would be probably the more species rich because they haven't had enrichment, nutrient enrichment, which the nutrient rich lakes and ponds would have. But you've got typical indicator species such as water crowfoot, which I've shown a picture of, and water mint. But that's just a bit of background, but we really want to move on to the species. As I mentioned earlier, one of the information sources that I use is the Field Studies Council's fold out charts and the one on wetland plants, water plants, and that divides each of the species into different areas within the habitat zone. So you've got submerged species, you've got emergent and floating, and reed swamp species, and you've got marginal species. That's a very basic summary of the different sections you get, but there are overlaps, of course. So you do get some species that sort of inhabit part of one zone and part of another. So submerged species, there's quite a few of these, but I thought I'd just highlight two non-native species or introduced species that you quite often will see in ponds. So you've got Canadian waterweed or Nuttall's waterweed, and these are the genus for these is Elodea. They're both fairly invasive, and they're from North America. They're also, some people call them Canadian pondweed and Nuttall's pondweed, which can be a bit confusing because there's also another species, a native species called pondweed, that's the Potamogeton pondweed. So just be aware that this one is the Elodea, not Potamogeton, and it's probably might be better to call it waterweed rather than pondweed to avoid confusion. So the picture of the Canadian pondweeds at the top and the Nuttall's waterweed, I should have said Canadian waterweed, Nuttall's and Nuttall's waterweed at the bottom. You could probably see better on the picture the Canadian pondweed, waterweed, the leaves are very blunt and rounded, whereas on the Nuttall's waterweed, they're quite tapering and pointed. So that's quite a good way to tell the difference. They both have tiny whitish reddish petals, which are quite difficult to see, but you can identify it quite well just by the leaves. And I used to see Canadian waterweed more, but now Nuttall's waterweed seems to be becoming more common within a pond. And this is, like I said, it can take over a bit, but it can also be beneficial. It could be an oxygenating plant. Although I'd recommend, if you are sort of having a pond where you want to put in oxygenating plants, I'd recommend putting in some native species, things like water milfoil or hornwort instead. So this one is definitely a native species. The next one, water violet, Houghtonia palustris. It is fairly rare, but you'll see it more often now because it's becoming relatively common to plant in ponds. And they have these beautiful lilac pink flowers that grow in a whorl, a cluster of flowers, and they will have a bright yellow eye. And you'll often spot it more by the feathery leaves that are partly submerged. And it's generally found in unpolluted ditches, ponds, and so on, possibly slow flowing section of a river as well. I've not seen it, huge number of times, but it is a good species to find. And it flowers about now, so May to June generally. So another non-native introduced and this one is very invasive species. Again, it's good to learn the scientific name for this one because it's got multiple names. The two commonest English names for it are New Zealand pygmy-weed or Australian swamp stonecrop. It's probably best to refer to it as Crassula helmsii. And I've seen this in quite a few ponds where it's just carpeted almost the whole pond and some of the drier areas adjacent to it as well. It's got tiny, as you can see the picture, it's got tiny white petals and very small linear leaves, and it'll be flowering fairly soon, sort of June through to sort of late summer, August time roughly. There have been there's quite a lot of issues with trying to control it. One of the problems is if you remove it and disturb the ground, it actually spreads even more. So they are looking at, there's been some recent studies done where they've been looking at biological control. I can't recall exactly what it was. It's some sort of invertebrate that does sort of reduce the vigor of the crassula. So that may be something that will help it, but it generally, if you once you've got it, it is difficult to control or remove. Right, so I'm going to move on to some floating or emergent species. Um, this is one of the two common native species of water lily, the white water lily, Nymphaea alba. They have very large white flowers that have like the central yellow section, but they have quite a lot of petals, so around 20 to 25 petals. So and the petal arrangement is very different to the yellow water lily. A couple of other key differences, which is quite useful to know this before it's flowered, because it doesn't flower till July or August. The leaves are very close to circular, and they have a sort of like a gap at the tip, which almost joins together. I'll show you the yellow water lily in a minute, but the leaves on the yellow water lily are nowhere near as circular as the white water lily. And they also, another key thing is that the leaf veins form a network, so they just spread out from the center towards the edges of the leaf. And you'll find this in a lot of ponds and lakes. I tend to see, I do see it fairly often, but maybe I maybe see the yellow water lily more. So this is the yellow water lily. The leaves, as I said, slightly smaller than the white water lily. Oh, by the way, it's actually, even though they're both water lilies, they're different genus, so they're the same family. They're both water lily family, but this one is Nupha lutea, so it's not a Nymphaea. And the leaves are more cordate rather than rounded. And I know you can't see it from this picture, but the leaf veins come out in a parallel pattern. So there's a line going down the middle of the leaf, and then they spread out to form, the books say, a tuning fork arrangement. So I suggest if you have a look in the books for that, you'll see how different that is from the white water lily vein arrangement. And the yellow flowers are 4 to 6 centimeters, so quite a lot smaller than the white water lily. And you probably can't see it brilliantly on this picture, but you do have smaller petals in the center and smaller petals around the edges, and 5 to 6 larger concave petals in the center. So it's a little bit like a sort of like the way you've got a daisy, where you've got a different leaf around, you've got two types of leaves, petals within it. And similarly to the white water lily, you'll find it in ponds and canals, and also slow sections of rivers. Flowering time can be slightly earlier than the white water lily. Right, so one of the things I was going to mention earlier that I forgot to say was the majority of the plants in this talk are what's known as dicotyledons. So they have two seed leaves, and they have a network of veins rather than and quite broad or lobed leaves. But there are some of the species I'm going to talk about today are monocotyledons, which the monocotyledons are plants that have one seed leaf. They have narrow linear leaves with just parallel veins, and the veins don't branch out in a network. So an example of this is the flag iris. Other examples are sedges, grasses, rushes, and this talk, for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to be covering flowering plants, not any sedges, grasses, and rushes, but that may be something that we cover in the future, because that is you know, a whole other area to learn about, and it's important because we do get a lot of those species within wetlands. So the flag iris, also known as yellow iris, family, genus is Iris, and the species name is Iris pseudochorus. You get these very tall, pointed, sword-shaped leaves, long, sharp-looking points, up to 150 centimeters, so very tall, and the flowers are beautiful as well. Got these 8 to 10 centimeters across with bright yellow and quite distinctive purple veins. If you look more closely at them, you'll see the purple veins, and those are flowering now. There's quite a lot flowering in our local pond, and they do seem to support quite a lot of insect life as well. So as well as in ponds, you'll find these in wet woodlands, marshes, fens, and so on, and should be flowering sort of into June, July. Right, so here just got 3 species, or there's actually another one in the next slide that are possible ones that can be confused. So these are all species from the carrot family, and just a bit of a warning about if you are looking at plants from the carrot family, that there's quite a lot of species within that family that are poisonous. So there's some of I think unless you're completely sure what they are, I wouldn't recommend picking some of them or even touching some of them. So things like hemlock water dropwort are quite bad, and some of the non-aquatic ones like hemlock are very poisonous, and also giant hogweed. So that's just people need to be wary about these species. So the first one I've got here, lesser water parsnip, Berula erecta, is one of the poisonous species. It's very similar in appearance initially to the Falls water-cress, Apium nodiflorum, and they will both be in very similar habitats. So you'll see them in ponds, fens, ditches, and marshes, and it's not, until you look more closely at them, it's not totally obvious which species it is. But I would say the first thing to look at would probably be to look at the leaves, and on the lesser water parsnip, the leaves are very sharply toothed, and a lot less rounded than the falls watercress. So the other thing about it is that they're generally, but you have to be a bit wary about this because individual plants do vary. Uh, Generally, you will have more pairs of leaflets within a leaf on the lesser water parsnip than on the falls watercress. So between 7 and 10 on the water parsnip and around 4 to 6 on the falls watercress. But there could be a bit of overlap. But I think the thing is just to look at more than one individual plant, and to compare it, but also to look at some of the other features. So generally with all plant ID, it's best not to rely on one feature all the time. So if it's flowering, you need to look at the the bracts and bracteoles on the flowers. So I'll quickly explain what they are. So within the carrot family, you've got an umbellifer arrangement of flower heads, like an upside down umbrella of multiple white flowers. Some carrot family are yellow, but the majority of them are white, and that applies to these two species. And within on the umbellifer head, the whole cluster of flowers, you sometimes have some small leaf-like appendages at the base of the whole umbellifer head, and that's what's known as a bract. And then for some species, you get things called bracteoles, which are below each individual floret within the umbellifer. So unfortunately, I haven't got any diagrams to explain this, but I suggest sort of look it up there's really good information in glossaries of books and on some of the identification websites and so on. So the key thing for this one is that lesser water parsnip has bracts and bracteoles, and falls watercress has bracteoles only. So it hasn't got the leaf-like appendages at the base of the whole flower head, just below each of the individual florets. So I don't expect everyone to remember that straight away, but it's something to look out for. And when you're looking in ID books, it will refer to that. And generally they flower more or less same time, maybe water parsnip slightly longer later in the summer. One other thing that the lesser water parsnip has, it has a ring mark on the stem, which is a paler mark immediately below the leaves. It doesn't show on this picture particularly well, but that's something to look out for, because if it hasn't got a ring mark, it's more likely to be falls watercress, but obviously you'd need to look at all the other features to work out whether it is or not. So the only other one I've got on here, the picture on the top right to the right, is greater water parsnip, which is quite a rarity, particularly in part of the country where I am, southwest, and I've only seen it at one site, an Avon Wildlife Trust reserve, and it's huge. It's just so much larger. Lesser water parsnip is a relatively small plant, but this will grow maybe sort of not quite as big as a flag iris, but getting towards that size. So the other confusion species, although I think it doesn't look that similar, partly why falls watercress is called falls watercress, is is the watercress. And watercress, scientific name Roripa nasturtium aquaticum. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's actually from a different family. So this is from the cabbage or crucifer family. And if you look at the picture, it's got 4 petals in each flower has a cluster of petals with 4 in each flower. So that is an indicator of it being in the cabbage family. And the reason it's called the crucifer family, often called crucifer family, is because you get the sepals immediately below it, the green part of the flower, that overlap where the petals are in a crucifer or cross format. It's not that obvious in this picture, but if you find species in the crucifer family, say things like cuckoo flower, which is another plant you'll get in wetland marshes, wet grassland and pond margins and so on, you will see that feature on species from the cabbage or crucifer family. So the leaves on the watercress are more broader, more rounded than the Falls watercress, very dark green. They are edible, of course. This is a plant that, it's cultivated, but you can eat watercress from the wild, although I wouldn't recommend it. Depending, certain places it might be okay, but some places that, you don't know whether it's polluted, and also the fact that if you're not 100% sure about whether it is that species, it could be a poisonous plant from the carrot family. It is definitely, this one is edible as long as you're sure what you've found, and it's relatively clean area. So yeah, fens, ditches, marshes and ponds, and it flowers over quite a long period. So you probably see some flowering now till the early autumn. So this is one of my favorite species. We're moving on now to sort of more the marginal species that will be found, say, on the margins of a pond or more in a wet meadow or boggy area or marsh. And this one is ragged robin. It's Silene blossciculi, and it's from the campion family, so it's closely related to red campion, lesser and greater stitchwort, mouse ears and things like that. And they've got these beautiful ragged pink petals. Occasionally they're white. I've seen white variants of it, and they are very distinctive. The flowers on this species. So I think once you've seen this, it's a relatively easy one to identify. But they also do have linear tapering leaves, so quite long, thin leaves. And as I said, you'd find these in the sort of marginal areas like the fens and pond margins. And I've seen some of this flowering recently, and that'll flower till later in the summer. Another very attractive plant is the flowering rush that you'll find in marginal places. So it's a bit of a confusing name. It's not a rush at all. It's not one of the Juncus species, the genus that is, rushes. But it's actually from the flowering rush family. Which is quite a small family in the UK. There's not, I think this might be the only species, but I'd have to check that. and the genus is Bitomus umbellatus. And the scientific name gives you a bit of a clue about the flowers. They're umbels, like in a similar way to the carrot family would be. So more or less like an upside down umbrella, a cluster of flowers that grow out from the stalk, and they've got the rosy pink petals with very distinctive sort of darker pink stamens as well. So that is quite noticeable. And this is another species that I mentioned, like I mentioned before, with the flag iris. It's a monocotyledon. So this has long, linear, and sharply pointed leaves that just have parallel veins, and they're three-angled. So they're sort of almost triangular in a way, like so that sort of leaf arrangement. And you'll find that on muddy substrates within still and slow moving water. So you will find it in some streams and rivers where it's slow enough, but also ponds and lakes. And that won't be flowering until July through till September. So this species, brook lime, is one that you'll find a lot on pond margins. It's often planted in ponds, or a lot in marshes, wet meadows. I've seen it in wetter areas within woodlands as well, and next to rivers and streams. And it's it's one of the speedwells. So the name is Veronica Becker-Bunger, which is my favorite scientific name. I think it's just a great descriptive name as well. It's and it's from the figwort family, and it has these very bright blue flowers that are fairly small, roundedly flowers, quite similar in a way to the flowers for Germander speedwell, which, if you know that, known as bird's eye speedwell. But that wouldn't grow in such a wet habitats. And you get these shallow toothed and oval leaves that are quite blunt. They're fairly small leaves, about 3 to 6 centimeters, and it often has a creeping habit. So it'll, if there's some, if you put some in a pond, it'll spread out from the pond, and we've got some in our garden, and it's sort of spreading quite a long way. So, but it is a beautiful flower, and it's flowering now, and it does have quite a long flowering time. So this is another monocotyledon. So the branched burr reed, Sparganium erectum. So it looks like it's more like a sedge or grass, but it is a flowering plant. But it's got these very distinctive spiky and globular flowers that are on branched racemes. So the raceme is like a sort of spike of flowers, and there's different certain species will have little branches on them. So this one it's got branched burr reed, as the name suggests. There is also an unbranched burr reed, which is smaller, slightly less common, and you'll often see those in the river, and they have a well, not too often actually, because they're not as common, but you're more likely to see the unbranched burr reed in a river. and they have sort of some floating basal leaves that look a bit ribbon-like. But the branched burr reed, I tend to see this mainly in still and slow-moving water, quite often on the margins of a river or stream and pond margins. It can become quite abundant in ponds, so it can take over a bit. But you can see on the picture, it shows quite well the difference between the male and female flowers. They're both spiky and globular, but the male ones are the smaller ones above and the female below. And you've got, as with all of the monocotyledons, you've got long linear leaves, which are parallel veined and very and they're quite keeled at the base. So that's quite a distinctive thing to look out for. And those should be flowering fairly soon. Once you've seen, they are very distinctive, the flowers, so once you've seen them, it's a relatively easy one to learn. So this is the final species I'm going to talk about. This is bogbean, Menianthes trifoliata. This is from the bogbean family, another quite small family like the flowering rush family. And this is very often planted in ponds. It's a good wildlife, a good species for lots of wildlife. And you'll also see it in bogs and fens, those sort of habitats, marshy areas. Can't see it on this picture, but they've got quite large trifoliate and oval and untoothed leaves that are grey to greenish in colour, and fairly large leaves. And then you've got this spike of white and pinkish petals, and with the conspicuous hair fringes. So you can see on here that they do look like they've got little hairs growing off them, and the flowers are sort of star shaped, so with 5 petals. So I'm just going to finish off by talking a little bit about some of the conservation issues that are affecting wetland plants. So it's important to remember that it's the biggest decline of biodiversity of all habitats, wildlife worldwide. It is affecting wetland areas. So there are various reasons. I've mentioned climate change already, and that does affect some areas, drying out, becoming a lot hotter and so on. Also, more extreme weather events, of course. And within England, 90% of our wetlands have been lost since Roman times, and there's been much more rapid increase in losses of habitats in the past 100 years or so. There are various reasons for that. I can't go through everything in detail at the moment, but these include some farmland drainage and conversion to farmland, pollution and nutrient enrichment, but also inappropriate or lack of management in some sites. So some areas that have a good range of aquatic or wetland plants may be unmanaged and revert and succeed to wet woodland and lose some of the interesting species. Even though the wet woodland is a good habitat, it can also result in the loss of some rare species, and overall the loss of species diversity and abundance is obviously a big issue. for wetland plants and wetland fauna as well. There's a few things that can help with this, like reducing the amount of sewage and fertilizer that's going into land and wetland areas, although I don't think we, as a country, are doing that particularly well at the moment, to say the least. We need to do more things like rewilding and natural processes such as introducing beavers, which does seem to be happening more. But there's lots of things that could be done. But I think having natural processes as part of the way we manage things is really important. So that's it. I'll answer some questions in a minute. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Neill, for that. That was really interesting, really helpful. I know when folk tackle their wetland plots or their freshwater plots, it can be a little bit daunting, especially because they can be quite tricky plots to get to in the first place. So I did wonder if you had any sort of top tips. You covered submerged species in the first part of this talk. I wondered if you had any top tips on how to actually view to ID those submerged species.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, you need to think about safety with those. Depending on how close you can get, I have used nets before to collect samples. There's things you can use called grapnels as well, where you throw in the sort of hook that pulls out bits of vegetation. And then ideally, if you can, take a sort of a tray to put some water in, to put the specimens in, and take sample bags and analyze them at home if it's too difficult to work it out on site, and photos, of course.
Yes, photos definitely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Something we always do mention within MPMS is, of course, safety. We do ask that our volunteers be really careful and not to necessarily lean over too far. And as tempting as it is, don't get in. I mean, we've had a few folks say, oh, but if I have wellies or waders on, but we always say, please do not enter the water. Thank you, Neill. There were some really useful tips there. I just did have one other question, actually. You mentioned the introduction of beavers. Neill, are you able to sort of explain what sort of positive impact that can have on these habitats?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on beavers and what benefits they bring, but they do create sort of habitat niches by sort of managing area. I'm trying to think what the phrase is now, but I can't remember it.
Spot.
But they do, when they fell trees and so on and create dams, it does create new wetland areas, ponds and so on. And there has been evidence that it's produced increases in populations of amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, and lots of other species. And it does create some areas where there's more dead wood as well, which is beneficial. So things like woody debris within the wetland area are good.
Thank you ever so much. I've got a few extra questions here. So someone has popped, sorry they missed the start of the talk, that's absolutely fine. So please, would you be able to mention again what books you would recommend for wetland plant ID?
Right, yes.
As well as the FSC guide.
There was one other book that I forgot to mention, which I used for some of the habitat information. It's the Wild Guide to Britain's Habitats. So that's a really good book to look at. That's got a lot of background information on all habitats, not just wetland, but it's got a lot of information on wetland. But for the identification, I'd recommend the Wildflower Key by Francis Rose, which covers all flowering plants. it's not just wetland plants, but it is a very, I'd recommend that to all botanists, and ideally get the second edition. So that's got a bit more information. It was updated, an updated version. Also, British Water Plants by Haslam, Sinker and Wolseley, which is a Field Studies Council book. So that's good. That's one that does a key of identification, looking at various features and keying it out. And the other
Brilliant.
one was the Guide to Commoner Water Plants, which is Field Studies Council chart, and that's by Richard Orton, Anne Bevington, and John Bevington.
Brilliant. Thank you. Somebody's asked for you to say the name of the Lemna guide again. I think you've covered them
Oh
all
yeah,
now.
it's Opal. It's jointly the Opal and British Society, Botanical Society of the British Isles, BSBI. It's called What Else Lives at the Pond? Guide to Duckweeds. So if you search for that, you should be able to find it. So it's Opal, and it's a partnership with that's Field Studies Council and Natural History Museum as well. So it lists 6 species of duckweed, so it's very useful to look at the
Oh, brilliant.
key differences.
Well, actually, somebody has mentioned you having a list of the guides on our website, which would be very helpful. So if you
Yeah,
actually
well,
take a look at our training and events pages on the MPMS website and head to online training resources under the freshwater habitats, there is a really handy document that provides additional supporting materials that breaks down a number of recommendations, but that has put me in mind now. Thank you so much to go and check that and update it with the list that Neill has given today, actually. So Neill, if you're happy to send through a list, I can always
I have
update it.
got a references sheet for wetlands if
Oh,
anybody
fantastic.
would like that. And it's mainly plant information, but it does cover some aquatic invertebrates as well if people want that information.
Yeah, I think that would be incredibly helpful, actually.
Yeah, I can
So
do that.
I'll add that to our freshwaters category within our online training resources. But something else just to mention, because you mentioned Francis Rose and other keys, we are running a using botanical keys how to unlock species ID workshop online in July. So do take a look at our events to take a little look to see if you'd be interested in taking part in that as well. Right, moving on from that little plug, hang on, I have a couple more questions. Someone has noted that the reeds are taking over their wetland. Should we try to contain them at all or let them flourish? There are areas of wet grassland which have been flower rich, which they are starting to dominate. So do you have an opinion? Very difficult to know, not knowing the site, of course.
Yeah, I think it probably would need some limited management and cutting. I know somebody's put on a comment on about rotationally cutting reed bed. So yeah, I'd agree with that comment that's been mentioned there. So yeah, you wouldn't you will need it will need some management, definitely.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the comment about rotating the cutting. But the additional question that actually came with the last question was, yeah, should we be cutting the main seed bed? So I believe we've answered that now. Another really good question, actually. We've mentioned changing climate, of course, and somebody's asked, with increases in water temperature, would that affect the flowering period of some of these species we've been talking about today?
Yes, I think it would. To be honest, I haven't seen any specific studies about that, but I'm sure there have been. But yeah, it would affect that. So it's difficult to say, or it might affect some species more than others. I don't think it would be just that you could generally say it would affect all species. So that's not
No,
really, there's a bit of a vague
no,
answer.
yeah. There'll be some species more tolerant than others, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And just one, realised we just got time for one last quick question,
Okay.
which is, do you know of a map of wetland habitats that can be accessed? Now, the one I'm thinking of off the top of my head, Neil, you might have another suggestion, is the Living England map.
Mm,
If you search Living England map from Natural England, I believe that
yeah,
is really
that would
useful.
have
Yeah,
habitats.
map of different habitat types.
You may be able to get that information from your local records centre as
Yeah.
well. So they should have a habitat layer within their mapping system, and I think they should be able to let you have a summary of that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. That's all timed absolutely impeccably because we're coming towards 1:30 now. So I'm getting a lots of thank yous for a
Great.
really interesting talk in the chat. So thank you ever so much, Neil. As I say, this has been recorded. So if you want to come back and refer to it at any point, you'll be able to find it, or you missed the beginning even, you'll be able to find this on the MPMS Support YouTube channel in due course. I'm afraid I'm not going to get a chance to pop it up today, but it will be there very soon. And please do take a look at our other webinars that are coming up and our other events on our training and events pages. Thank you so much, Neil. It was lovely to
Thank
see you
you.
and hear from you. And I'm looking forward to the next training session with you.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Very best. Thank you all.